Okay, so there's this YouTube channel called Moonchannel, which keeps getting recommended to me, at least as a few times, where he's done some videos about gotcha games, and I guess they took off, and I was vaguely aware of them. But his most recent video spouts a very specific perspective that I think kind of betrays a lot of the perspective that he's coming from. It says a lot about himself. He seems really defensive about liking gotcha games for some reason. And that's why it's like, can cake teach gamers to respect women? It's him being defensive. He tends to talk about it in that kind of way. But regardless, in that very video, at around 13 and a half minutes, he gets into this one section. I only want to play part of it. And it's almost word for word a certain very specific ideological perspective.
The history of the world is the history of men. In early human societies, in hunter-gatherer societies, men hunted and women foraged. These were roles born of biological differences, of physical necessity. But though these roles were different, they were devoid of hierarchy. In the beginning,
so he's denying that human history always had hierarchy, and that when humans were hunters and gatherers, there was no such thing as hierarchy, ignoring the entire idea of warring tribes, or the fact that there's like animal packs, wolf packs, the common turn of phrase determining the pecking order. It talks about chickens pecking at each other to determine who the dominant one is, more or less. So we see a lot of animal hierarchies all the time. There's certain kind of animal societies that inherently require things like gender roles and hierarchies for them to function. So like ants and bees and a lot of insects and certain things like that. So we see this also occurring outside of humans, and animals don't develop societies like he's implying. So he's implying that before societies there were no hierarchies, then we had societies, and then there were hierarchies.
there was no distinction of authority between men and women.
And
however, as we all know, might
denying
makes right, and physical strength could be used
between
to
men
seize
and women
land
to an
or
extent.
resources, which became especially relevant once humans settled down and became static agricultural societies. As men biologically possessed more physical strength, we took control of the land and resources and built myths and narratives to justify our control. We called it the divine right of kings, or the mandate of heaven. And these...
So what he's referring to is this typical thing about human societies and religion, and the idea that men specifically reframed human society so that they made up this idea of God, and going from the top down, God being this ultimate authority figure dictating how society should act, more or less. Obviously, there's a difference between mono and polytheistic religions, but it's more or less generalizing that in a broader sense. And technically, there's a non-theistic religion like Buddhism, but atheists like to deny the idea. The idea behind Buddhism is sort of a correct way of life, and it's not specifically about having an authority figure that is in charge. It's sort of complicated, But that's why there's been debates about are Buddhists theists or atheists that people have had, because that's not Buddha's role per se. But we don't need to get into complexities like that, like religion. But he's essentially saying that I'll keep going.
Systems that we made to justify our control separated the world into hierarchies. There were kings.
See, so he's talking about this all being a product of social conditioning after society was developed. That there is nothing else inherently to them to make this stuff exist. Already taking this stance that all religion is false, which, you know, fine, you can argue that perspective. Many people have argued that perspective, and you can have that perspective. But there's still more to that. What the stuff he's saying specifically conforms to a certain ideological way of thinking. And I'm not talking about feminism. And you'll see.
Nobles, burghers, freemen, and peasants. There was the emperor, the court, the craftsmen, the merchants, and the farmers. And there were men, and there were women. The history of the world is the history of men because men have made a social construct out of increasing.
See, so he's blaming all of this on men. Men are the ones who made society this way. However, he's talking about that's oppressive and male dominated, and the perspective that God dictates everything or whatever.
Irrelevant biological differences, and have justified this social construct.
And that biological differences between men and women are irrelevant.
Intellectual justification in philosophy, in theology, and more. Fields of study dominated by men which purposefully excluded women. This system,
and that men have intentionally, deliberately excluded women from history and whatever their participatory roles were.
Of justification
which
that
seems
we men
ridiculous,
built, a system that oppresses both men and women with its strict hierarchies, with its gender roles, is the P word.
So specifically that hierarchies in gender roles are this product of social conditioning, and they couldn't otherwise exist. Although we see gender roles and hierarchies in animals, in nature, all around us, I guess those are also a social construct or whatever. And again, you can try to argue that point, but there's a certain specific group of people, a certain specific person well known for making these arguments.
A word the mere utterance of which will turn away half the viewers currently watching. If you've stuck around this long, I hope you'll stay with me here. The P word is patriarchy. All right.
See, now you might think, oh, that's the feminism thing. He's talking about feministic ideology. No, I'm not getting into that. Because what I noticed is practically word for word a reutterance of a perspective that Karl Marx had when he was talking about German ideology. All of this part gets into it, like first premises of materialistic method. But when you get down to where I was before, kind of near the end, he says Germans specifically had this ideology that things were dictated from God down to man, and the reality is that things go from the earth to God, that everything about society is a product of our need to survive, and it ends up being this total denial of human free will and of human nature and things we witness in nature. It denies certain fundamental, basic, observable things surrounding us like that. And, people also cite this work as saying like socialism is a product of a socialist society. So like you create socialists in a socialist society, you create capitalists in a capitalist society. The society determines what people are. People do not determine society. That is essentially the stance that Marx tends to take. And this is also supported by other people's interpretations, and not just Marx's own words, but other people interpreting Marx's work. You can see it down here. Marx criticizes the traditional conception of human nature as a species which incarnates itself in each individual. So total denial of individualism in a sense. Instead arguing and denial of free will. Instead arguing that human nature is formed by the totality of social relations. Thus, the whole of human nature is not understood as in classical ideological philosophy as permanent and universal. The species being is always determined in a specific social historical formation, with some aspects being biological. Pretty much almost 100% denying human nature and free will and any concept of individualism, and the fact that you can make personal decisions about yourself. And this is why someone like him is obsessed with the idea, like he needs a Nike, goddess of victory, to somehow be positively affecting society for him to justify being interested in it, because otherwise, like, he thinks, okay, games objectifying women will thus then create men who objectify women, which is why people like him are opposed to this, which is why you see feminists opposed to it. It's why you see communists opposed to it. Like, I just read about Marx and showed you specifically where he makes these kinds of references. At least one place where he makes these references. If you are more broadly familiar with these ideological positions, then you'll tend to see the other writings that have that perspective. And so an example of why this is stupid, and this perspective that objectified fictional characters is somehow bad or wrong or something, can be summed up pretty easily. So here's one example. Fictional characters are not people, they're objects/ideas of their author's creation. You cannot objectify them because they have no personhood to be deprived of. They are toys, posters, characters, models, etc. It's okay to objectify fictional characters because they're already objects. That's basically true in a sense, but the communist perspective is that allowing media with these things will thus mind control society to have negative views about women, because humans don't have free will. They're just a product of social conditioning. And again, here's another example of someone kind of refuting the perspective. I really think everyone needs to truly internalize this. Fictional characters are objects. They are not people. You cannot objectify them because they have no personhood to be deprived of. They have no humanity to be erased of. You cannot disrespect them because they are not real. So I've always had this perspective that things like the attractive drawing of a man or woman or whatever is largely inconsequential to society. Video games that have attractive men and women in them that are deliberately objectified or sexualized are largely inconsequential to society. If you personally feel that playing games or watching movies or certain things like that has a personal negative effect towards you, you have a responsibility over yourself to only engage in hobbies or media that you feel has a positive influence on you or that you're comfortable with dealing with. Personally, I'm not generally very into horror stuff, but I wouldn't say it's uh, that influential on me. But I don't generally feel like it does me good personally. So I tend not to get into horror. I recognize that it could negatively influence me, so I tend to lean away from it. And it's not a big deal, and I think everyone can have responsibility of over themselves to make the right choices and take care of themselves and try to maintain their personal mental health. Like, we don't need society to be our parent for us and decide what is morally good for us, especially with this communist perspective that rejects the idea of God or any kind of ultimate authority. You want to kick it back to man in an arbitrary way to determine moral authority in an arbitrary way. Like, there's no argument here. It's inconsequential to objectify fictional characters. So don't feel bad about it. If consuming media that doesn't make you feel bad makes you feel bad, then don't consume media that makes you feel bad or has a negative influence on you. And just try to be self-aware that certain things have a negative influence on you.